Have you been in Berlin the whole time?
Yeah,
How are you
we
enjoying it?
were the first couple of years. We kind of went back and forth between Toronto and Berlin for a little bit, but we're pretty established here now. Even though we're still only temporary residents, because
Yeah, yeah,
German immigration is not the easiest thing to manage, of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
What was the attraction to that city?
Um, I mean, we found ourselves coming to Europe a lot to just to play and tour because we were getting offers, and so we figured it would be advantageous musically and culturally, I guess, just to come here and not have to travel back and forth all the time, and then we could take advantage of more opportunities to play. And we first came to Berlin in 2007 for a show and had a day off here. Had really no expectations about the city other than like, fictional representations of it. So didn't really know what to expect, and really found it like a very charming city and
Mm.
rough around the edges, definitely, but at the same time, very kind of welcoming and kind of a liberating place, I guess.
Mhm. And it does feel to me that Europe has kind of reemerged as a center for meaningful contemporary music. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, it's weird to compare the music scenes between Europe and North America because there are so many musicians in both on both sides of the Atlantic making really good music, of course, but the reality of trying to live and work as a musician is very different.
Mm.
And especially in Canada, where touring is not impossible, but pretty difficult. And if you think about, population density, Canada has what, 35 million, and Germany alone has 80 million.
Yeah,
So already the country itself is almost 3 times as much.
yeah.
So you can do a 2-week tour in Germany alone and play every night if you wanted to. Wouldn't be always that great, but you could do it easily enough. So it's really, yeah, it was really just sort of like a question of being able to go out, play as many shows as you could, and not actually kill yourself driving or flying, or just, the machinations of touring in North America are really a challenge.
And that's no small thing because it means, I suspect, for someone like yourself that you can dedicate yourself professionally to music 100%. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
that is accurate. Yeah. But also it's important in a kind of DIY sense because we can subsist as DIY musicians here, and means we don't, I mean, we are part of the music scene and the music industry, but I feel like we can get by here doing more ourselves than we could back home. Like we would be more reliant on other people in Canada or the US to tour or to release records than we are here in Europe.
Mm.
And that, I think, is an important element to my musical career, is having this sort of, I don't know, sense of control over things.
And I would suspect an openness among both people in the industry, but of course, people who appreciate what you do. It does seem a different kind of a reception outside. I'm not going to generalize, but maybe I will. Um, there's a kind of narrowness that I perceive still in North America outside of specific kind of subcultures, whereas there's a greater
Yeah,
appreciation in other parts of the world for the new.
that's true. Um, and certainly if you compare the way culture is accepted here compared to the United States, less so in Canada, but still to a certain degree, the idea that it has a place in society seems pretty well established here. And when you're touring in the US, you can play a lot of places, but you get treated pretty shittily, and you really have to fight to actually, get paid and get treated well, and just get by as a touring musician.
Having been there now for a dozen years, do you see that as connected to the long history of arts and culture in Europe? That there have been um, there has been an avant-garde, for example, in Europe for centuries, right? And so you are part of a continuum of a tradition that maybe doesn't exist in other parts of the world.
Yeah, that could be an element of it. Um, I think part of it is sort of like vestiges of socialism, even
Oh,
though Germany is pretty capitalist these days.
yeah.
Um, there's much more of a social network here, and I think that that extends into the cultural spheres more so than it does back home.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I have to ask about the last couple of years, though. What's that been like? Understand that a place like Europe offers touring opportunities that don't exist, but of course that's all fallen apart the last couple of years. So what's it been like?
It's been difficult. Um, I think we were pretty lucky that we got some work that we could do outside of touring, some soundtracking jobs that I got, and like things like mastering and mixing, as well as recording. So we did kind of take the time to do sort of not a sabbatical really, but to just take the time to recharge a bit because we had been touring so much. So in a way, that break was welcome. The nerve-wracking part, of course, was trying to find some ways of paying the rent.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we did have some jobs that did that, and we were able to get some support from the city of Berlin, that they were pretty good with offering grants to artists and freelancers to help people just get by, and they were like cost of living grants basically. So that was definitely helpful. Um, yeah, so we only just started touring again. Um, we had some shows last month in Norway, and we did play a few shows last year, either outdoors or in like very controlled circumstances. So yeah, it was definitely a weird couple of years,
Yeah.
but not necessarily bad in a way. In some way, yes, I know it probably sounds strange to hear somebody say that, but yeah, it was a time to sort of recharge a little bit, which was welcome. I guess the scary part was not knowing when we would be able to come out of it.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I'm not surprised actually, because I my inbox was flooded with some of the most remarkable work over that 2-year period.
Yeah, a
And
lot of people were working, weren't
a
they?
lot of people were working, right? But they focused all of that energy and time on producing some pretty spectacular music.
Yeah.
And not just that, it was music that for me reflected what was happening. Did you find it creep into your music?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So what
Yeah.
was that like?
Well, I've always had a fondness for post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction. So when the pandemic first hit, I thought, okay, here we go. We're getting into fiction has become reality. And that maybe is an exaggeration, but to some degree, a lot of things that people were writing about that I had been reading in recent years did happen. And that was scary to see that happening and not knowing how people or society would deal with things like that. So I think that came out musically, maybe in this idea of, I don't know, uncertainty or not fear of the future, but trepidation a little bit,
Mhm.
how things are going to pan out.
I think you're in good company there. I think a lot of us who love this music have always been fascinated by um, that dystopian take on the world.
Yeah,
And while I think clearly this was a medical emergency that was an issue separate and apart from societal impacts, there was also this going on, right? That what we were seeing was a real life example of a lot of ideas that have kind of fascinated us for most
Yeah.
of our lives,
Yeah.
right? And not to put too fine a point on it, but it was, just to observe, it was an extraordinary thing to take in.
Yeah. And it was interesting to see how different cultures or different countries
Yeah.
kind of responded to the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And we visited Canada last summer. So last summer, time also got pretty nebulous over the last 2
Yeah,
years.
sure did.
Yeah, last summer, and comparatively, the way Canada dealt with the pandemic seemed much more chaotic than Germany did, and much less supportive in a way. Germany made a lot of mistakes too, of course, but it definitely felt like we were working together to get through it a bit more than the sort of fractiousness that was happening in North America.
Yeah. Switch gears a little bit. If someone has never heard you, how do you describe your work?
Um, I mean, I guess in a nutshell, I use ambient experimental. That's the easiest sort of phrase that comes to mind, but that's pretty limiting because I try to do a lot of different things if I can.
Is there is there a consistent theme through that? Is there, for example, you've got pieces that feature vocals, you've got pieces that are obviously instrumental. Um, Principally a guitarist, fair to say, but a
Yeah.
multi-instrumentalist to be sure.
Yeah.
What brings it all together?
I suppose the sort of, I mean, ambientness is a sort of connective thread, I suppose, because there's always sort of a sense of that atmospheric kind of sound.
Yeah.
Even when stuff is minimal or spare, it's that a whole idea of drone or ambient or extended sound form kind of plays a role.
I have been turning around in my head for years now this desire to explain this period in music and what it is reflective of. What is it that's going on in this music? It's so varied, right? We're talking about a broad spectrum of artists, but there does seem to me to be this connection to, what I call modernism. That's the whole theme of what I do. Mm-hmm. That embrace of the new, but also something very much about the 21st century and the world that we live in. Does any of that resonate with you? Do you have a take on that? Am I thinking too big, maybe even? I'd love to hear that feedback.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty grand scope, yeah. But I guess personally for me, it's a way of kind of parsing external reality, and that we're very much living in like a post-industrial technological world where sound is everywhere. Yeah. Even in the middle of the country, you're going to hear sounds if they're natural sounds, but especially in cities or urban environments, there's so much atmospheric sound that it's really hard to sort of delineate sounds that you want to hear versus sounds that you don't want to hear. And I know, I can't remember who it was now, somebody said noise is any undesired sound signal. So arguably every sound can be musical. And I think that my being drawn to these sort of atmospheric or drone sounds or textural sounds is my way of sort of taking internalizing my external reality.
And why do you feel compelled to do that? What drives you there?
Well, I think that's a pretty common impulse, is just explaining the world. you know, making up a story to explain what happens around you.
Mm. And so in that sense, it is very much reflective of the time that we live in.
Yeah. And I think that, as you say, there are a lot of musicians working with that kind of sound, that textural ambient sound. And I think it is about incorporating that outside world and trying to make sense of it and express it or re-express it in a way that other people can look at it and say, oh, I recognize how that relates to my own reality too. So we share a certain something through sound.
I love that take, because oftentimes that reflection is quite literal, right?
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
case of field recordings or noise art, it
Yeah.
is just the world kind of turned back on itself, right? Saying, here's what you sound like.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. I'm curious about your thoughts on electronics in this music, which I do think you use, but not heavily. Again, you're principally a guitarist. Why that approach? What is it about that instrument in particular that drives you?
Um, well, as a kid, I studied classical music, classical flute, actually.
Mm.
And I did that for many years and enjoyed it to a certain degree, but felt very confined by the traditionalness, traditionality. My English is also failing because I live in yeah. The traditional, the sort of traditional restraints of like the classical musical world, and specifically an instrument like flute, which has a very narrow field of repertoire. And one of the biggest things that I had a problem with was not being able to play just by myself without an accompanist or ensemble or whatever. So turning to guitar was a sort of move to self-reliance, self-sufficiency in a way, in that I could play songs and sing or whatever, and be my own contained music just with that one instrument. And then as I started using more electronic gear, that became even more developed, with the idea with looping pedals and samplers and such, that I could create what sounded like an orchestra or a full ensemble just using a single instrument and some electronics. But at the same time, I didn't want to exclusively just be an electronic musician. I wanted to be able to combine that analog sound or timbre or feel expression with the utility of electronic gear.
Mm. And have you realized that vision? I mean, 20 years of making records, and
Yeah.
an extraordinary output. Do you feel like you've captured what you had in your mind?
Yes. But then I keep having new ideas, or at least I hope I will keep having new ideas that I want to express or capture.
Mm.
So, and then each attempt to capture something kind of spawns the next thing in a way. So it's like a sort of reciprocal feedback loop in a way.
Has your output increased, or am I just on different mailing lists right now? It seems to me like I think I've seen 4 or 5 new releases from you in the last month.
This last 6 months or so, I've had a lot of stuff coming out, but most of these things were recorded during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So it's about 2 years worth of work when I had no other distractions.